right after this break. Welcome back to this special program. It's the latest in the Joy National Dialogue series. Now tonight, we ask, should Ghana face east or west? This program is live on Joy News and on Joy 99.7 FM, as well as on Facebook Live, YouTube, and X Space. You can be a part of this dialogue by using the hashtags East or West and hashtag Joy Dialogue. My name is Kojo Yankson, and it gives me great pleasure to moderate tonight's engagement. Before I introduce our panelists, here's a bit of background for the conversation. We face neither east nor west. We face forward. Those were the bold words of Kwame Nkrumah, uttered right here in Accra back in April 1960. Words with which the Osajifo communicated his vision for a continent that was not beholden to the self-serving superpowers of Russia, America, and Europe. Well, now, here we are in 2024, and our resource-rich continent is still the battleground for the crucial scramble for natural resources and raw materials to feed the ever-growing industries of the East and the West. Now, they want our resources, but what do we want from them in return? And which of them is best placed to give us what we need at the lowest economic and diplomatic cost to our state? Is it even a binary choice? These questions form the foundation of our national dialogue this evening. Now, for the next 3 hours, we're going to hear erudite speakers tackle this essential question of the geopolitical direction of Ghana and Africa. Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh is the Executive Director of the Ghana Ghana Center for Democratic Development. Dr. Yao Graham is the coordinator of the Third World Network Ghana. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo is a lecturer at the University of Ghana's Department of Economics. Yao Nsakon is the Executive Vice President for Unilever Ghana and represents an amalgam of professional bodies. Bright Simmons, Vice President in charge of research at Imani Center for Policy and Education, will also join us. Now, Bright is playing a special role on social media tonight, and we will be sharing his posts here as the conversation unfolds. So let's get started. Here in the studio with us, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo is a lecturer in the Department of Economics at the University of Ghana. Of course, with her rich economic background, she's able to give us that context to our conversation. Prof. Chumesi-Bafo, it's great to have you. Thank you for making the time. And I'm glad we're able to start with you, because maybe that can help us answer the first part of the questions before us, which is, what does Ghana want from the rest of the world?
Thank you very much, Kojo. Good evening, and good evening to your viewers and listeners. It's a pleasure to be here. I believe that Ghana, as a developing country, wants a lot of things. But for us, the sustainability of our growth, which will be translated into structural change and transformation of the lives of the people in Ghana, is what we seek. And so in seeking that, what are the issues that we should be looking for? And based on the quotation you made from Osajifo Dr. Nkrumah with regards to Ghana facing neither east nor west, I believe that the words resonate up till now. It is still quite relevant. For me, I am of the considered opinion that Ghana should face Ghana's interests. And so for that matter, whoever comes on board to serve the interest of the country is what we should pursue. So we should pursue an agenda where we are dealing with a diversified group of people, countries that are helping us work towards the agenda of growth and development that we desire. And that kind of desire is a sustainable one, not a random walk kind of growth that we tend to find because of overall our resource dependence nature of our economy, the import dependent nature of our economy. So when you cast your mind back to, for example, our relationship with the West over the period, you would see that pivotal in that relationship, I must say, would be in the early 80s, where Ghana and a number of other developing countries embarked on the era of structural adjustment, economic recovery programs. And based on that, you find that a lot of policy prescriptions that came at the time, in addition to the resources that came to sort out the economic challenges, were based on basically the Washington Consensus. And over time, we have realized that a number of the policy prescriptions that were given to the country could not really fit based on the peculiar nature of the challenges that we face. And so for that matter, the overemphasis on neoliberalism ideals, free market economy, privatization, liberalize and let the private sector take the center stage. In not too distant future, we have observed that, for example, the successes or the miracles of the newly industrialized economies means that it is not the one-size-fits-all ideal. You need to come out with a strategy that works for each peculiar circumstance, because a lot of the policy prescriptions took it for granted that the institutions that existed in the developed world also existed in the developing world. But we face certain challenges that could not make those policy prescriptions translate. And so for that matter, and when you look at some of the cooperations and the conditionalities we have had with the West, you see that there's a lot of emphasis on democracy, institutional reforms and all that, more like a precursor for development. And other countries such as Singapore, Thailand, and all that have shown us that really democracy can be a significant necessary factor for development, but it is not really enough. You need a number of things. We need resources, we need investment, and that is what we lack. For that reason, when you look at recent times, China is offering that, Russia is offering that, and when you look at the strategy, is basically they are telling you that resources are available for economic cooperation. China is emphasizing on a South-South win-win cooperation, not like a master-servant dictating issues to you. And so they are emphasizing more on sovereignty and your free will to do things. But then that is also coming with a lot of suspicion from the West with regards to issues of how African countries finance and all that. And so I would say that Ghana should pursue an agenda with Ghana's interest being paramount, and anyone who comes on board with a strategy to help us move to the end that we are seeking, it's welcome.
Now, before I bring in Yaw Nsako, who joins us via Zoom, let's see if we can sort of situate the strategies, the individual strategies of the various blocs that make up the East and the West. So we find that Europe and America tend to have a similar strategy. They want to use debt and aid as their sort of carrot and stick to gain control of resources in Africa. Then you have China that offers infrastructure and credit. Then you've got Russia that comes with this very interesting new approach of military as foreign policy. So they will give you military assistance, and in exchange, they will take a few of your resources. Now, some see the West as the devil you know. We've been associated with them for such a long time. We kind of know how they operate. We know what they want and we know what they offer. It seems a safe space. The Eastern push is new. Like you said, it's faced with a bit of suspicion. So in your assessment, looking at what Ghana's unique situation is, do we play it safe or do we dare to look east?
I think we should not play it safe, but we should be cautious in engaging with the East. Why do I say so? The reason why there's a bit of suspicion with Eastern cooperation, it's how liberal it appears to be without conditionalities. And we know that there is no free lunch, essentially. And the reason also is that even within the West cooperation that we have had over the years, with stringent requirements of transparency, anti-corruption, and all that, we still find ourselves where we are. And so in that regard, getting resources and engaging with the East without a lot asked with regards to issues of governance, transparency, corruption issues, and all that. And indeed, when you look at the strategy China has adopted, it's basically infrastructure development in Africa. We know there is a big infrastructure gap, and that is the reason why there is a high cost of doing business on the continent. Africa is fragmented. We are just too pocket-sized in terms of the economies. We agree that there is the need for regional integration. Regional integration requires infrastructure. We do not have the needed resources to make up for that infrastructure, and so cooperation is required. But it is even estimated that with all the infrastructural development that China is investing in on the continent, it is still not enough. But even said, with all this, we realize that infrastructural investment is also an avenue for corruption on the continent. And so you find that there is usually white elephant projects. There are projects without enough allowances for maintenance, and so for which reason projects are overvalued, and that means that their returns are not adequate to pay for themselves over the period. And so getting some resources somewhere without a lot asked as to what the conditions are and all, if we are not careful and we do business as usual without a lot of transparency, I'm afraid a lot of African countries, including Ghana, would find ourselves in deep debts.
I want to bring in Yao Nsako. Now, Yao Nsako, of course, has been a major part of all of our thought leadership events here on Joy News. Yao, it's a pleasure to have you this evening. Good evening.
Good evening. Hello, Priscilla, my good friend.
Yeah. Now, finally, we're having this discussion. It's been a long time coming, but as we start to shape the conversation, something has become glaringly obvious. First of all, maybe I should state, this is really not a binary conversation. It's not just East and West. There are other players. There's the Middle East. There's the novel strategies of the blue economy coming from the South. There's a lot. But the glaring omission is the clearly stated desire of Ghana. What does Ghana want? How do we go about starting to answer that question?
Yeah, you remember that when we started to speak about this, I said that I hoped that it was not going to be a panel that all agreed, because the theme was such that I could not see that there would be much disagreement. And I was just listening to Priscilla, and I was saying, well, okay, maybe all the other people... Do I still have you?
Yes, we're here.
All the other people will more or less say the same. Since we're going to be on for some time, let me just start by saying, for me, the formulation of what Ghana must do must begin by us saying, whether we look east or west, why are we looking in the first place? We have tended to normalize certain definitions of development, which in my view give the impression that so long as the elite more or less are doing well, the lucky 10%, as they call them, then we are developing. And then we have all these financial indices that we attach, and we say we're growing X%, Y%, and we're happy. But for me, the starting point of the development discourse is how do we lift the majority of our compatriots into dignity? That really is the key thing. If we set that as the true north, then the rest of the question resolves itself. We know where we are going. The only way that I'll formulate it slightly differently is that we should not wait for people to say this is what they offer. We must, knowing the contour lines in which the world is shaped, we must approach people and say, this is what we bring, this is what we think that you can bring. We try to look for win-win constructs and we move on. That's how I would look at it.
That's a very succinct summary of how we ought to approach it. Thanks for that. And of course, Yaw Nsakun is with us for the duration. We'll be hearing more from him. I want to bring in Dr. Yaw Graham. Now, he's the coordinator of Third World Network Ghana. Third World Network Africa. Thank you. Forgive me for diminishing your geographical coverage. But it's very nice to have you. Thank you very much for making the time. So now this big existential question, East or West, and we've already kind of set everybody into their roles. The West seems to be the devil you know, with their loans and aid and very clear conditionalities. Then we have the East that seems to suggest that, well, do what you like with the money, just make sure you pay back, otherwise you owe us a harbor. That tends to be the sort of Belt and Road strategy we hear from China. Then we have Russia with this brand new idea that, we'll send you some mercenaries and give us some diamonds in exchange, or gold, or whatever it is in that mine you have in your country. Now, if what we want is development, are there some very clear directions in which we ought to immediately embark? And what, as a voter going into an election, what should we expect to hear potential leaders say about that direction?
Yeah, thanks very much, and good evening to your listeners and viewers. I think Yaw Nsakun made an important point, which is about basically framing the question around whose vision of development, whose Ghana are we talking about? This is important because depending on whose Ghana you're talking about, even if what the point he makes about, that you need, and also Priscilla made, that you need to look for a diversity of sources, the permutation of the things that you look for, the permutation of the relationships that you form will differ. Let me give you a historical example to illustrate the point. After Nkrumah was overthrown, the new NLC/Progress Party, NLC was the military regime, we put the Progress Party in power. The new NLC/Progress Party regime was very keen to be seen as an ally of the West. So they broke with what was the African consensus and started talking about dialogue with South Africa and sent the foreign minister to South Africa at a period when apartheid was at its most brutal, not long after the Sharpeville massacre. Yeah. Now, they defined Ghana's interest at that time essentially as starting from a presumption of a strategic anchor with the West. That's how they interpreted their notion of Ghana as a market economy, Ghana as a democracy. Of course, Ghana was ridiculed. Ghana became a joke. And it took a very long time to position ourselves back in the Committee of African Nations. Why is this example important? Because at that time, decolonization was a point of consensus for the continent. Decolonization was important because African countries believed in regional integration. For regional integration to work, it was recognized that that southern cone of the country which was dominated by settler colonialism, was incompatible with the notion of a free Africa integrated and building itself. So maybe they didn't share this vision of an integrated Africa. They saw their relationship with the West as primary. So they were ready to jump through the hoops of a relationship with apartheid South Africa and be isolated in Africa. There are consequences that flow from that in terms of your relations. So whose interest is extremely important. So if you take that, I think there are a number of elements that Priscilla spoke about which I would like to add. I mean, even the notion of regional integration. Whose definition of regional integration? Now, there are many elements in regional integration that we can all agree on. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is being negotiated at the moment. A lot of people see it as an expression of Pan-Africanism. But at the same time, a lot of ordinary people are saying, we want a borderless Africa, where we can cross borders and go around the continent. The AICFTA is about free movement of capital, free movement of goods, okay? And also, say, services. Now, of course, that is important for the continent. But people feel that the borderless, the ordinary people can go and come, is not being taken account of. Now, I'm raising this so that, I mean, if you're a big company looking to move your goods to country X in Africa and access that market, it's great. If you are a tourist, an African tourist who wants to go to another African country, you may find it difficult because the free movement is not there. Now, so that at the end of the day, therefore, what a government conceives to be the national interest is based on what ultimately sees as the best equilibrium of contending interests in a society that then packages its foreign relations. And foreign relations here is not simply around politics, but also around the economic questions, you know, that she was talking about and the sources of investment. So if you took it that way, then of course the national interest is defined in a particular way. And to take your East-West thing, now when the United States saw the Soviet Union as this great strategic rival, and was aware that there was a split between the then two big communist powers, China and the Soviet Union, they saw an opportunity to drive a wedge and isolate the Soviet Union. They were against communism, but the United States facilitated the admission of China into the United Nations to displace Taiwan, who up to now they continue to arm. The United States saw the possibility of a big market in China. The United States supported the admission of China to the World Trade Organization, which allowed China to have access to markets around the world. China joined the WTO, China joined the IMF. China became the biggest lender to the United States. China, the biggest manufacturing platform for the United States, even as the United States saw it as a strategic rival in Asia. I'm just giving you this complexity. So we need to see the complexity that ought to go into this. So if we take West Africa now, where we have a regional security problem with armed insurgencies and so on, we need to be interested in a common regional approach. What does that mean for how we relate with our neighbors? At the moment, our relations with the Sahelian countries are strained. So I'm just throwing this out. I don't give you a direct answer, but to offer a view that depending on what you see as the national interest, you construct your economic and political and security relations in a certain way. So the present government, taking a view of how to deal with the terrorism issue in the region, clearly feels that relations with the United States and NATO is priority. So our president went and sat in front of Blinken and basically snitched on Burkina Faso. And he felt that was very important. They are next door to us. Even if you disagree with them, how do you manage it? for me, really, these are foundational to a definition of how we build relations.
Yeah,
so if China is lending to the United States and it's a source of investment and manufactures, if it's good for the biggest power in the world, should we be basically following the United States to say China is a threat to the world? They may be in competition for dominance in the world, but we are a small country looking for capital, looking for markets, looking for technology. How do we play that business? That is a moment definitely not to look east or west. At any moment, therefore, that complexity should guide how you permute your relationships and sources of resources.
Yeah, thanks for that. Now, just before we come back into the studio, Yao, I wonder, I have to satisfy my curiosity. You were hoping to hear views that you wouldn't necessarily agree with. Have you heard any yet, or are we still all in alignment?
But maybe as we discuss into deeper detail some of the cleavages in points of view, but I just listened to what Dr. Yao Graham was saying. I'm sure he's wondering why I'm calling him with his title, but since there are two Yaos, we're going to have to distinguish one way or the other. And I agree with everything that he said. The only element that I'll keep stressing is that much of our conversation, and perhaps may introduce the word that everybody knows I'll introduce, in this neoliberal construction, a lot of what we talk about when we say regional integration and so on and so forth, I'm not too clear in my mind exactly what we're trying to integrate. And I think that's what y'all was touching on. Are we trying to integrate states, or are we trying to integrate people? So when we talk about continental free trade agreement, is it an integration of the African people, or is it an integration of the African states? And if it's an integration of the African states, what is the character of those states? In my view, those states have never been sufficiently or comprehensively decolonized. They have kept the character of being captured by the elite. And so if it's an integration of states, then what tends to happen is that it's an integration of elite interests. They are similar class interests. They facilitate the movement of their fund flows to benefit them. And we say that we are making progress with all of these things, but you look at the mass of our compatriots and things are not moving. Let's look at a few indices. The World Food Programme recently said 1 billion Africans are undernourished. In spite of all the noise and celebration and hoo-ha about Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, we still have 3% of GDP. Nigeria, which is sitting right next to us, according to the Trade Resilience Report, the Ghana Statistical Service, this is not my data, Ghana Statistical Services brought out 2.5% of our exports go to Nigeria. If you look at our own exports in Ghana, it's 20% to Africa. So a key part of this is that the rhetoric seems right. The reality is very far away. And in my view, as I have tried to study and understand this, a huge part of why you see this significant decoupling is that the discussion about governance in Africa, the discussion, therefore, of foreign policy orientation, what y'all was just talking about Akufo-Addo going to sit before blinking, has completely left behind the people themselves. I doubt very much that if we had a process of arriving at some sort of consensus on how we should treat relationships with Burkina Faso, the people of Ghana, and when I say the people, I don't mean only the elites, I mean all the people, would have said that the way to resolve a problem with a country that we have a history of fraternal relations with is to fly somewhere and go and report them. So for me, looking east or west is not really what the issue. What is at the storm center, the epicenter of what we are trying to do? The epicenter has to be that we are trying to secure the long-term health of our society, and particularly the mass of our population that for 67 years, 70 years, whatever it is, have been left behind. We are configuring things so that whatever the alchemy becomes, we are able to look back and say, at this point we started, now we can see that they have gone significantly up. In that construct, I think you all touched on it as well, East and West become a little bit irrelevant. There was a certain construct of geopolitics in which East and West, post-1945 world, Cold War, etc., it meant a lot. Today, when you say East and West, what exactly do you mean? Is Japan part of the West or is it part of the East? Not totally clear. Geographically, it belongs somewhere. There are those who think that the Bandung spirit, as Samir Amin used to call it, looking at it from a point of view of the global South and the global North, is much more important because all of us are rising up against certain specific hegemonic powers. The markets are already, they are not empty. And if you're going to try to go at it as Ghana, Gambia, and so on and so forth, you don't stand a chance. So you need to come together. But in doing that, there are several elements that are playing around. What sort of systems should we borrow? We have, for example, without necessarily acknowledging that that is the situation, because of our colonial history and so on, our default position, we tend to know a lot about what the former colonialists are doing, but what other people are doing. When you ask many Ghanaian intellectuals about the details of what is going on in Asia, for example, they're a little bit lost. Latin America, they are lost. That spirit of consensus that in 1955 led to Bandung, in 66, Tricontinental in Havana, got people together to think about how you can lift the countries that had been left behind, the periphery, if you want me to call it that. That seems to be broken. And for me, that is the real conversation that we need to tackle in the development and in the foreign policy discourse. I think East or West, we can settle it in 10 minutes. You go around, everybody will tell you it's going to have to be a mixture. It's going to have to be a delicate balance of whose priorities are we really championing and which realities are we facing.
Well, I certainly am interested in the detail of it because, if it's going to be a mixture, what do we do with the East? What do we do with the West? What do we do with Russia? What do we do with China? What do we do with Europe and the US? What sort of specific deals do we strike with each of them? Now, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, of course, has been Executive Director of CDD Ghana for a number of years now. It's great to have you, Prof. Indeed. So while all of this is going on, it occurs to me that this is the first time that we've introduced this as an election conversation. Why is that the case? It seems to me such a fundamental question. What do we want and who do we want it from? Why have we not demanded these answers from those who wish to govern us?
Well, I think probably part of the answer to your question is that to be able to answer the framing of this binary framing, I think around the table, as I was driving in, I paid some attention to what Priscilla and Yao and Yao have been saying. I think around the table there's clearly an emerging consensus that rejects this binary framing of the issue, East or West, for a number of the reasons that both Yaos have enumerated. But I think the question also presupposes a certain agency on our part, right? I mean, to be able to look East or West, South or North, Northeast or Southeast, assume that you are in a position of exercising some agency. And maybe if your observation is correct, maybe the reason we're trying to inject this kind of question into the election debate is that we know we are in a place where agency is not something we can take for granted, right? We have huge constraints on our ability to make choices for reasons that, some would say our own doing, for some reasons of international geopolitics, political economy, and all of those things. But I think that we are in a place now where, unfortunately, our options appear quite limited. And so really when your options are that limited, you also find yourself in a place where you may not be able to make the wisest bargains for yourself, because really you've put yourself in a bind and and you are not able to make the best choices for your country. So there's a sense, I think, that there's a certain concern, not only in Ghana, but across Africa, that people are signing away their birthrights, that we're, for a mess of pottage, we are willing to make Esau-like decisions, in a world where the Jacobs are all over the place and are trying to play us one against the other. So I think that the emergence of this as an election year issue may not necessarily be surprising because of where we are and a certain recognition that, our agency is severely constrained. But I also like, and I think I just want to really just follow on some of the points that have been made here, that of course, if you frame the question this way, east or west, Yao makes the important point that our historical default, just by virtue of where we're coming from, colonialism and all of that, is of course the West, right? But even that, what are we looking to the West or to the East for? For me, it's an important question. What exactly are we looking? Is this about looking one direction or the other for models, political models, economic models? Are we looking for inspiration? Are we looking for capital, for technology, for ideas? And I think depending on what it is that we are looking for, you would find that, the options are not necessarily that binary. I think Yao made an important point, Graham that is, made an important point of, taking us through some of the evolution in the relationship between the US and China. So the US itself has looked east before, right? When it suited its strategic interest at a point, and these things are fluid, right? So at a certain point in its historical, in the evolution of its foreign policy and relations in the world, it looked, to make friends with China, drive a wedge between all of those kinds of things. And today we are in a different place. The US is in a different place when it comes to China. And China has also looked west before, right? Not just for ideas, for a number of things, right? So even the opening, at a time when we in Africa were probably making a lot of noises about multinational companies, China was switched gears and then said, well, some of you just come in here and do business here. China, we talk about globalization, but China is one of the biggest beneficiaries of this whole globalization story about, WTO and the like. So both sides, if we take them, China and the US as representing the polar opposites and representing both sides, they've looked, in their respective, in the opposite direction for inspiration, for capital, for alliances and the like when it suited their interest. And I think that, of course, the intelligent position would be to say that, yes, to the extent that we too are a nation state and have our own interests and our priorities, we ought to be able to make those kind of a la carte choices, depending on what it is that our interests are. But the agency question is important, because when you don't have a lot of agency, then that's when, this issue becomes a tough one. So, I think that we are all saying the same thing, essentially. Right? But it starts with a definition of what it is that your interests are as a country. And it's also important that this is not a monolithic thing. Within the country itself, there are different competing interests. Whose interests predominate? Whose interests define the national interest? Is it the particular clique that happens to be in power for the time being? Is it the interest of the mass of the population? And I think, for me, one way I see this is that, from the dawn of independence, our fundamental interests have not changed, right? So what was it about? It was first about sovereignty, right? Seek ye first the political kingdom. And Nkrumah meant by that, free yourself, from foreign domination. And then other things will be added. The other things were development. They defined them in terms of freedom from hunger, from want, from poverty, from illness and disease. So all of these freedoms, when you express them in another form, was really development, that's what we call development. So seek first sovereignty, political, economic, and then you work on the issues of development. And I think fundamentally, those interests have stayed steady. I don't think anybody will tell you those are not our interests, right? Those interests have stayed steady, maybe with some nuance, maybe sustainable development has now been added onto it because we now have to think about intergenerational development and sustainability of the methods that we're using. Those have held steady. What has changed, I think, and what has also presented this question of choices between East or West is that at some point, we started off making certain choices at independence, right? And they were not choices about development or whether or not, but about methods. How do you get to the destination? Development is your goal. You want food security, you want social cohesion, you want to be free of conflict, you want education, a well-trained population, you want all of those things. I think in the early years, the choice then, which was also not inconsistent with what was happening globally, was in favor of very heavy state-centered approaches, which had implications for the political choices we also made. So we basically almost made a bargain, suspend democracy and human rights and all of those things, and we'll give you development. And I think we ran that bargain. That bargain ran its course somewhat for 30 years. And then when the harvest that we got, both politically and economically, did not seem, we're not content with it. It had taken us into, depending on the country, conflicts, economic collapse, failed states, especially in our region. Then also, I think the primary model at the time, the Soviet, then also came collapsing around the same time. So then you had this rethinking. Okay, so we've carried on with this model for some time. It's not worked. Whether or not we carried on with it with any fidelity, it's another question. But we chose non-democratic or authoritarian projects as the means of delivering development. They did not work for 30 years. So then we switched. We said, democratization. And then it came along with also market, neoliberal market economics around the same time, roughly the same time. So we switched. That has run another 30 years, right? So I think the time is just about right. We've had this 30 years, and a 30-year hitch has come, so maybe let's reassess where we are, how we're doing with this other approach to the business. But I think our fundamental interests, I would not say have changed. Now we are at a point where we are assessing, which of the approaches to development would appear to work in our context.
Prof, if indeed you're right that step one is to seek sovereignty and freedom from all of these ills, poverty and disease and so forth, if that's step one, does that not perhaps fuel the argument that we should be moving away from the West? Because historically, they tend to come along with conditionalities that attack sovereignty. We're currently in the middle of this massive confusion around this LGBTQ bill that Ghana insists on passing, that the United States, is signaling their displeasure with, and the threat is there. We'll take away your aid, we'll take away your loans, sovereignty seems to be the first thing you lose when you go west, isn't it?
Well, I'm not too sure that, again, sovereignty in whose interest, what kind of sovereignty, right? So sovereignty also, in its contemporary understanding, also includes, on the part of state parties, a responsibility to protect, right? So the fact that you can mount sovereignty when you are actually butchering your people to death, right? And some non-state actor, some external power says, but you cannot do that. You say, but I'm sovereign. I'm free to just butcher my citizens to death, right? I don't think that that's the sense in which we should understand the term sovereignty. We are not. Citizens are not basically slaves of the state. That whoever happens for the time being to manage the country can then use sovereignty as a shield to do to their citizens whatever it is that they want. I don't think that's the understanding of sovereignty. But it's also even the choice, even the things you mentioned, LGBT and all of those kinds of things. You have to also to ask, how much agency even do we have in those choices? Right? Maybe the United States is protesting the bill, but do we also know what other external interests are behind even shopping those bills around? Why are they all of a sudden in currency in Africa? You go to, are they really the primary concerns of African citizens and governments? And this is where we are, that of all the things we face, Uganda, Kenya, Malawi, Senegal, Ghana, these things are making the rounds, roughly the same template. Is that really what are we being diverted? Is our attention being diverted in somebody else's agenda? They may be, and the agendas may come not necessarily from state actors. It may not come from the United States as a government. But the agendas, they are also strong private interest. The evangelical right wing in the United States, shopping all kinds of things around the world, right? So some of these things, we are fighting other people's culture wars. It's not really our fight. These kinds of things did not, all of a sudden, boom, Ghana is talking about these things, right? But so the agendas are not always, coming from state actors. We know that. They come from very organized, strong, organized, if sometimes fringe minority interests. They could be corporates, they could be religious, they could be other things. But, basically you have to just ask yourself, what is it that I'm delivering to my people? Is this really what the people want, what they need? Or is it a diversion in an election year where, the economy has crashed essentially? Is this what we are selling the people? So even when you talk about sovereignty, and I think it goes back to your point, whose sovereignty? In Ghana, whose sovereignty? The regime in government, the political class, the establishment, the people as a whole? These are not just monolithic, even the concept of sovereignty, like of national interest. They're just not easy to define monolithically. There are different competing interests within the polity, and one or the other would want to elevate theirs to the level of the national to displace everyone else. So it's a very complex question, I think, as all of my my peers here have said, but it's also a very important conversation that we must have.
Doc, perhaps you indulge us with a bit of economics. Let's do a bit of cost and benefit analysis, right? And maybe we can go around. We can start with the West. I mean, I keep referring to them as the devil, Forgive me for the terminology, but we know them. We've come a long way with them. Let's do cost and benefit. When we deal with the West, what are the pros? And what are the risks? Let's go round the table, if you will, starting with the West.
Right, I believe that, like you said, the devil, I think that we are quite used to the mode of operation of the West. But I must say that in our experience with the West, you realize that, for instance, when you take the persistent IMF intervention in our economy, it's more like a 4-year cycle. And every time the program will come with policy prescriptions, we will do a lot of work on the macroeconomic issues, attain the short-run goals, stabilize the economy. But the hard issues of working on the structure of the economy, working on institutional changes to make sure that we facilitate business and make sure that production flourishes in the economy, you don't tend to find that. And so you see that we attain short-term gains, stabilize, get all the macroeconomic indicators on track, and then the slightest shock, everything comes crumbling down. And so the issue really is that going forward, I think that we should focus more on addressing the structural challenges that keeps us where we are consistently. And so, for example, and that is why I said that in our strategy towards the East, when you look at, for instance, our trade between Ghana and China, it is basically export of raw materials, import of manufactured goods. It's been the same with the West. When you look at, for example, there have been trade agreements with the US, for example, like the AGOA, There have been agreements like the EPA, for example, with Europe. Yeah. And you find that consistently, we still do the same thing. We are dependent on primary commodity exports. And so for that matter, if we don't do anything to transform and add a bit of value to the primary commodities we send out there, no matter which block or whatever we deal with, the outcome will not be different. The outcome will not be different in the sense that if, for example, the resources China is offering is quite attractive, it doesn't come with a lot of conditionalities. Yet, in dealing with them, we are still exporting primary commodities and we are importing manufactured goods. It is evident that in the long run, primary commodities, the prices of primary commodities relative to manufactured goods falls over time. So you certainly will lose competitiveness. You cannot compete. Your trade balance will always be in a deficit and you always find yourself in a fit, regardless of whichever bloc or country you are dealing with. And so for me, I think that the strategy, like we have all agreed, is to be, what do we want? And at this point, I think the emphasis is on building structures so that when the economy comes back on track, we grow in a resilient way. We grow in a way where we are adding value to a lot of our primary commodity exports, for which reason we can command a lot of value out there, and we will not be that vulnerable to the slightest external shocks that we observe.
If you just joined us, of course, this is our national dialogue. We're asking the question, should Ghana look east or west? We're making it an election discussion, and our guests, Professor Priscilla Chumesi, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo, who you just heard from. We also have Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh of CDD. We have Dr. Yao Graham of Third World Network Africa. And we're joined via Zoom by Yao Nsako. We're live on Joy 99.7 FM as well as here on JoyNews. And of course, you can catch us on X Space Conversation and on Facebook Live and YouTube as well. Use the hashtag EastVWest or East or West. You can also use the hashtag JoyDialogues. Prof, just before I move on to Dr. Graham, I've noticed something. Almost everyone on the panel has spoken quite extensively about the West, and when we come to the East, we've heard a lot about China. Everybody's avoiding Russia. Are they that scary? Don't they have anything to offer us economically? And is there a way of accessing it without blowing up our democracy entirely? What are your thoughts on Russia? In fact, I'll hear from Doc on the economic side of it before I come to Dr. Graham, if that's okay.
All right.
Yes. So, Doc Priscilla and then Doc Graham.
I think the narrative around Russia's involvement in African economies is also the fact that they are coming without conditionalities, placing a lot of emphasis on sovereignty, a lot of emphasis on the right for you to do whatever you may. So for that matter, it looks, but in terms of Russia's engagement, you find that it is more towards security, military assistance, and to a large extent, I am not quite sure of the statistics with regards to trade with Russia. And so in that regard, and then issues of, they have not had much quote-unquote good publicity with regards to their involvement in economies in Africa. And so there's a lot more suspicion, and probably on the back of what is happening with Ukraine, everybody is quite, their involvement is quite unsettling, and also with reports of their involvement in mercenary actions in places of unrest in Africa. It is a bit unsettling, but I must say that I am not a political scientist.
Dr. Graham, we're still doing pros and cons, but perhaps you'll start us off with Russia, and then we can go through China and the West.
Yeah, I mean, I want to return to, I'll say something about Russia, but I just want to be a bit contrary at this point.
Okay.
That, I mean, the way the conversation has gone, I mean, it's pointing to the fact that to get value out of this conversation, we should escape the straitjacket of the East and West. Escape the straitjacket of framing the problematic in terms of the two powers who are in contest with the United States or in contest with NATO. Because it's important, not that they are not important for us, but once you identify those two countries. For example, currently, the UAE is putting more money into Africa than China. But nobody is talking about the UAE. Just points to the fact the Gulf countries are very influential in the problem in Sudan, which is a strategic problem for this continent. They are present in Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, that whole zone there. You know, Arab, conservative, reactionary, authoritarian money from authoritarian Arab regimes is shaping this our continent. So I mean, when I saw the East or West, quite frankly, I saw it as a play on Nkrumah's famous statement. And being a journalist myself, I saw it as a nice headline. But once we leave the headline, we come to the substance.
That's right.
If we continue to frame the discussion in terms of, you know, how to get the public drawn in, I think we'll be shortchanging the public that we've drawn, you know, into the conversation. Now, I think on Russia, again, just like China, there's too much of a discussion about Russia, which has been framed by its geopolitical contest with the West. Okay? And this is a geopolitical contest which has suddenly become a problem. Because when the drunkard Yeltsin was in charge of Russia, and Russia was in the pocket of the United States, Russia was not the problem. When Putin came to power, relations were very good. Okay, Germany bases their strategy for energy around relations with Russia. So the Nord 1 and 2 pipelines were built, and all of Europe was getting Russian gas. It was very good for them. Then the tensions about the post-Soviet political and security settlement became more and more contentious. When it broke down over Ukraine and Russia invaded, suddenly the thing changed. Then we began to hear a different language. So I'm saying it's important to discuss Russia outside the evolution that suddenly Russia is in conflict with the West. When yesterday, Russia gave all of them cheap gas. Even now, people are importing a lot of things from Russia because they can't get it from anywhere else. So for me, in all these instances, it's important to step outside. Whatever we think about the war in Ukraine or Putin, I wouldn't like to live under him. Okay? Whatever we think about him, it's important to frame this issue as from a Ghanaian and African perspective. That is the sense in which I understand Nkrumah's aphorisms. We are looking neither east nor west. Not as a straitjacket, but as a representation, you know, how we should see, you know, our autonomy. Now, Russia, I mean, it's a country which offers various things beyond the Wagner, you know, troops. Many countries around the world are buying their nuclear reactors from Russia. This is something they export. I mean, I'm not a fan of nuclear energy, but it may interest you to know that our energy transition plan projects 70% sourcing of renewable energy from nuclear in Ghana by 2040 or thereabouts. So if the government has told the world that Ghana is going to be predominantly 70% nuclear, as part of our energy transition in about 25 or so years, Russia becomes a relevant factor to think about. And energy transition is a major issue that we need to take hard-headed decisions on. Russia supplies nuclear fuels to all countries, including reactors in the United States. Okay? So when we deconstruct the thing away from geopolitics and begin to look, at Russia, Russia has a lot of dependence on mineral export and mineral processing, chemical industry, and so on. Are there things we could learn from them? Are there things we can do with them? I think we should pose the thing in its complexity. Do we want to have a military pact with Russia? I mean, this government doesn't seem to have any difficulty having a military pact with the United States. I saw a very arrogant United States ambassador recently explaining away the presence of American troops. So, $20 million is a good sum of money to give to your military in exchange for us being here. And the business about, Ghanaian kind of officials and institutions not being allowed access to where we are. I mean, it's similar to if I came to your house and you gave me a bedroom. Surely you will knock before you enter the bedroom. I mean, this is not considered a problem. But we are worried about the people whose troops are not here. I dare say that part of that problem is that we have become used to being dominated by the West. The familiarity with the West is not only because they've been around for a long time, but the dominance is hegemonic in the sense that it's internalized by us.
It's like Stockholm syndrome.
So that's why the unfamiliarity with Chinese, small-scale Chinese miners are getting more grief than Newmont is getting. Okay? Newmont entered this country on terms which are almost unconstitutional. 30-year stability clause and so and so. Nobody talks. What I'm trying to say is that dominance and the thing about sovereignty that Kwesi spoke about, there are so many levels at which we've given away our sovereignty and we celebrate it. Okay? And if you accept his point about the condition of our ordinary people as a primary concern, the areas where we're giving away our sovereignty are the ones which are impeding our ability to improve people's conditions. So we should talk about the EPA. We talked about the trade agreements, which mean that domestic producers are under pressure. When we talk about the Chinese not having conditionalities, the terms that we grant them for exploiting the minerals, conditionality comes in many forms, I will not interfere in your politics so long as you allow me to dig as much minerals as I want for as long. So I think we need to, so the Russian thing, to come back to it, I mean, Russia has been framed in a particular way. It's an authoritarian regime, like Saudi Arabia, which is very close to the United States. But Saudi Arabia is in the pocket of the United States, not a threat to it. Okay? Now, there are things about Russia and other authoritarian countries that we should learn from negatively. Okay? So that certain forms of entanglement with them could be negative for us. So whilst we talk about the economic thing also, I mean, we should also ask, who do we want to do business? It's not a kind of unconditional business. There are some people who say, listen, this regime is so ugly that we don't want to be seen with them because of the values that we have as a country. If we have a constitution which sets out a certain vision of society, okay, that should also have a bearing in terms of where we draw the line in terms of certain relations. Sweden was a pacifist country for a very long time. And it was a point of national pride. They identified with it. Ghana, in spite of all that has happened over time, we still are respected as a pillar of the African community. Now, these things are important. So some of them, there may be pressure put on them by some of the relations that you may want to get into and so on. So these are important. But back to Russia, I think if we look at Russia beyond the security problem in West Africa, where NATO troops are being kicked out of the Sahelian countries, and ask, what is even the West African interest in security? It goes back to my earlier point. I mean, I don't know that we are even managing the security problem in the region very well. With the disintegration that ECOWAS is facing, it makes a regional security conversation more difficult. So some sophistication may be required. It is complicated by bringing, Russian troops. It's a sovereign decision they've taken. It's done now. It's kind of brought the French out, Russians in, NATO out, Russians in. It brings a certain kind of geopolitical competition into the region, which complicates the conversation. But there's more to it than that.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should also contextualize the fact that Russia is already in Africa. We're not now considering whether or not to do business with Russia. They're already here. And the effect that they are already having is visible. So you talked about how the Sahelian countries,
One country.
One Sahelian country seems to obviously be, struggling, and Russia's taking advantage of that situation. But I wonder if there is strength in numbers, and it's in our interest for blocs like ECOWAS and AU to work, should we be concerned about what some describe as a disruptive influence of Russia in some of the less stable nations within these blocs?
France has been a disruptive influence in West Africa since independence. The reason why ECOWAS has not been working is because of France. So even before we come to a minor player like Russia in West Africa, this is what I'm talking about. We take Western domination as part of our DNA. Why do you think people are in revolt in Francophone countries? The whole economic arrangement is underpinned by a framework set up by France. The CFA, its convergence criteria, is similar to that of the euro, extremely deflationary. So growth in those countries. And France, their reserves are sitting in the French central bank, supporting, France's balance of payments. So I think when let me be provocative and say that part of what is being said, you're saying about Russia and this disruption, this influence, is based on inadequate knowledge of the facts. And we take the French presence as normal. But those who live under it, I can tell you. So and that is why France supported Biafra. Because so long as Nigeria remains the most important power in West Africa, France cannot dominate it. France tried to get Ghana to join the CFA bloc. So if we look even at our region, the problem in this region is France. Even before we talk about, the attempt by Russia to get a foothold in this.
Now, in this dialogue, we're doing something special. We have Bright Simmons, who has been engaging on social media. He's been tweeting and sharing some of his thoughts, which are part of this conversation. And I can read a couple of them. I can read something from Bright Simmons for you right now, as soon as it's brought up a bit bigger on my screen. But you can see it from where you are, no doubt. Here we go. So this is from Bright Simmons. Okay, here we go. So I'll read this out to you. Bright Simmons is saying, Ghana's president has been reported as uncomfortable about Russia's presence in the Sahel. The first Ukrainian embassy in Africa is planned for Accra. Iranian exchanges have slowed to a trickle, and Cuban doctors don't seem to be prominent in the health system anymore. Signals or noise? Now, that's an interesting question to bring to our panel. I'd love to hear Yao Nsako on this. Yao, how do you assess Bright's approach to this, and talking about the very interesting question of whether these indications are signals of a weakening influence of Russia or a strengthening one? And in fact, should we even simply ignore them and perhaps focus more on what, for example, Dr. Yao Graham points out as bigger threats?
I suspect that, like me, many of my colleagues on the panel are struggling to digest all the points of stimulus that are being thrown at one go, because I was actually making notes as we were talking, and I can approach this question you just asked for several angles, but I also realize that we don't have 1 hour to just speak non-stop. So a few things that I want to say. One is, whichever orientation we take in terms of how we're going to look at things, etc., we've jettisoned the Cartesian framework of East and West. We also have to say, are we looking from a comatose patient lying on a stretcher? Or are we looking as people who are fit, the point that Kwesi made about agency? Because looking is one thing. You can be looking lying down on a stretcher somewhere and you're still seeing. You have the capacity, but what do you do with it? And when we talk about agency, it's very important that whose agency? Are we talking about state and the people who have captured the state agency, or we are looking for agency for the people? The other thing that we must throw into this conversation is that the chronic problem that we have with short-termism is very quickly creeping into this. So when we make comments like we have always known the West, who have we not always known? If you go back into history, that demarcation may considerably dissolve. I mean, Xu Enlai was in Bandung in 1955. So when China's return to the UN, you talk to the Chinese themselves, they will tell you, could not have happened without the African support. So there is a lot that is going on here, and I think my colleagues have tried to touch on some of these things. One that is very clear to me is that our sense of history is not what it should be. It has many things to do with our educational system, but also the nature of the media sources that we absorb, which mean that we learn about the world through other people's perspectives. We don't really invest time ourselves to try and understand what is going on. And then in this conversation, we sometimes look at things as though the coordinates are fixed. I mean, when you talk about Russia, for example, you are overly influenced by the immediate Russia, which is Putin Russia. I pointed out, if you step back to Yeltsin Russia, a whole new horizon emerges. If you go back to Gorbachev Russia, the point I'm trying to make is that even these coordinates we are speaking about, they keep shifting. So what we need to build is a capability, one, to recognize that whatever happens to the human race, we have to survive on this one planet together. And some of the rigidities that are sometimes thrown up and people get so fixated on them, yeah, they make good headlines, but the reality of the world is different. If you have built a solid governance system where your own people are very involved in what you're doing, the state has not been internally colonized by a small elite, you're in a better place. When the Chinese started to open up, you read about the details of what Deng Xiaoping extracted from the US under Carter when he went there. No African president can get that because we don't know what we are doing. We go there and we present ourselves as receptacles. What are people willing to give to us? And then we are going to make a choice. That seems to be how we frame the conversation. But the starting point, the starting formulation has to be, what do we want ourselves and for our people? Not for a small political elite that has captured power and is thinking about how to fund their political parties and vehicles and so on and so forth. So Bright talked about Cuba. Our links with Cuba have a very long history. Recently, somebody was saying to me, he said, you sound like you're, he said to me that Fidel Castro was an adolescent fad. And I said, do you understand the history of Africa when you make a comment like this? You understand the decolonization process, how Portuguese colonialism ended and so on. Part of all of that was the medical missions that were coming in. But if you're going to get a mix to deliver for your people, first of all, your systems must work. Today, what are those systems? We can't really throw them into Kolebu or into the rural hospitals, etc. When we go and negotiate with people and we say we want big investments for them to come and do things, are they coming to deal with the chaos that is our land laws today? We don't have conversations even about, listen, put your ears to the ground and listen to all the polarities. It's not just one of them. What is the big issue that many of them keep talking about? That they've been doing these interventions for a long time. Actually, there was a group of Chinese and American students who came together, and the big conversation about Africa was that the money that has been put in from both sides, they are not seeing it deliver. So more and more, I feel that the conversation, because you have these things, we must be careful of this person, we must be careful of this. Yeah, okay, let's be careful about everybody. But do we know what we want ourselves? That has to be the starting point. And then from there, you work out, knowing that you are in this world, you will always at a point in time have an interstate power struggle for domination and for a certain element of hegemony. That will always be there. You need to know how to navigate things. So the point that Chrissy was making about sovereignty, it also we should almost qualify it as intelligent sovereignty. One of the things that I see in Africa is this tendency to start shouting from mountaintops. Let's take the current president. In his first month or so, he was saying Ghana beyond aid. When you then ask, what is the detail? How are we going to do this Ghana beyond aid? There seems to be absolutely no plan. We talked about cocoa sovereignty. We are going to this, I forget the figures now, 100 billion this, we will take this. When you're taking on such powerful geopolitical forces, you keep quiet. And the example that I give all the time, in 1989, Germany through KfW still gave not a loan, a grant to China. The reforms in China had gone on for 11 years. The world was not clear in its mind what was about to explode from China, because Deng had focused on what he was doing and got on with it. Not just making big, huge noises. The last time they went somewhere, then Ruto came to Nairobi, had a press conference. Now when we are called, we will not all go. We will say, you cannot deal in the modern world in that kind of way. You have to be intelligent about the forces that you're dealing with. And for me, that is where the construct of the agency, understanding where you are, how you play with the forces delicately. When you demarcate into East and West, you tend to put Japan in the West. But look at the details, the historical details. When Deng Xiaoping came under pressure from the Western community, the traditional Western community after Tiananmen Square, Japan sent 88 people, a delegation of 88 people to China to say, we will stand with you, because they understood the interdependence. So for me, that is the framing. And the issue that we face most is not whether we've known the West for long, or East for long, or South for long. That's not, for me, what the issue is. The issue that we face the most is that our own organs, our machinery for delivery for our people has cracked. We are no longer able to do even the things that we say that we will do for our people or with our people, or that they tell us that they want. That, for me, is the real issue. So, and then you get into these shorthand things that if you're not careful, they get you carried away. Because I've heard you say a number of times, we have introduced this very important discussion to the election discourse. What does it mean? Priscilla, Chrissy Prempe, Yal Graham, and Yal Nsako sit down, and then suddenly it's a national discourse, and we have introduced it into the debate. We can easily feel that that's what we are doing, but believe me, we have not. If I go to King Tampo, are the people there talking about the things that we are talking about? When people ask me, if you are asked today, the people that the lead contenders in the elections, which of them on the things that we are talking about, which of them is going to really take a position? They're all ducking the issues because nobody wants to take a position that is even a bit difficult. Those are the real issues. Where are we going to have these conversations and be sure that we can hold our political forces accountable? And we're using Ghana as a case study, but it's a problem for Africa. South Africa is facing this issue right now. I mean, it's on the table. So that's the framing. The world will continue to move. We cannot just assume that as it is constructed today, Russia will have the same element of the global polarities that it has today going forward. We have to look long term. And in the long term, I think you all started to touch on that. There are resources there. Those resources are quite important. We cannot study geopolitics only by every day going onto the news and looking at what CNN is saying and Fox is saying and BBC is saying. Look also at some of the data and the trends. We say that there are all sorts of sanctions against Russia. Okay, suddenly India's exports of oil have gone up. And suddenly Russia's sale of oil to India has gone up. And suddenly all the people that were shouting and screaming about that, we need to put, everybody has just gone quiet because they've sorted themselves out. And then Africans find ourselves fighting, on whose side are we going to be? They have figured out how they are going to do it. And there are certain lessons from history that we must pick. If you let's take another example, the Sino-Soviet relationships. Mao was very close to Lenin and Stalin. By the time it came to Khrushchev, they had falling out. That's the nature of the world. So if you don't have people who know how to navigate in these things delicately, take Singapore as an example. They seem to be on everybody's side at the point, but at the end of the day, they lifted the well-being of their people. Today, 30 years after we got democracy, some kind of democracy, we can sit here and speak, and we're not being thrown into jail like Yao and the others were being thrown several years ago. But then what else do we say? What else are we able to point at? So we must be careful that when you make the discussion overly economistic, it sounds as though you just need to take a certain orientation to one power or the other, then the West is going to come and solve your problem. No, it's not so simple. The world is much more complex than that. Everything that we can produce for ourselves, today somebody supplies to us. So when you start to produce it for yourself, keep in mind that it means that somebody is losing that opportunity. And in a system where capital will seek domination, they don't take that easily. So those are the issues that, in my view, we must think about, or else we get fixated on the symptoms.
What I'm hearing you say, and I have to say I've heard every panelist say some iteration of it, is that this must start with Ghana deciding on its own model. What's Ghana's model? Before we start thinking of which model out there fits us, let's first decide what our model should be. So that answers the question of who are we and what do we want? Maybe we should get straight into that. We're going to take a break. When we come back, that's the next question that we will attack. Everyone on the panel will help us with it, including you, using the hashtags that we have presented. We'll also share the very interesting debate that's going on X, moderated by Bright Simmons, when we come back from these messages. You're welcome back to our national dialogue. This is live on JoyNews and Joy FM. You can also follow the conversation on our X space, as well as our YouTube and Facebook Live channels. You can use the hashtags East or West or the hashtag Joy Dialogue. Our guests tonight engaging us in some sparkling conversation and really giving us notes, copious notes to write. Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh is the Executive Director of the Ghana Center for Democratic Development. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo is an economics lecturer at the Department of Economics, University of Ghana. Dr. Yao Graham is the coordinator of Third World Network Africa. Yao Nsako is a thought leader and represents an amalgam of business groups. And the conversation so far, I mean, I don't know. It's your commentary on Twitter says it all. You're all very much into the debate. Bright Simmons is moderating the Twitter conversation. Let me read this one from at Kofi Amwa, who says, Bright, Ghana should lift up its head onto the hills where our help will come from. In summary, Ghana should turn to the north. Now, east, west, and south have brought us to where we are today. All right. Well, for this section of the conversation, I want us to look inward, not east or west or south or even north, but inward. I want us to start thinking about what Ghana's own model should be. Perhaps as a starting point, that would be a good way of determining what we do with whom. So what problem are we trying to solve as a nation? Prof. Prempeh.
Well, I think, to go back to my earlier point, I think we're still trying to solve the same questions that we put forth at independence, trying to escape poverty, trying to escape want and disease, and find a place in the sun for ourselves, at least from Nkrumah's perspective, right? He was more ambitious than just settling for basic, there's essential issues are of course important, but Nkrumah was a lot more ambitious. He also wanted us to have a place in the sun. But I think that there is also a danger when you say, we have to look inward, is that I think part of our problem is also a problem of insularity. I happen to believe that we tend to be too insular. And in doing so, we do not learn well from others, right? I mean, some would say there is nothing new under the sun. Well, there are new things emerge all the time. But, the work of development is not really about trying to reinvent the wheel, right? Part of the lack of historical or lack of appreciation of history that Jan Sarko referred to, I think it's also about the histories of other places, the histories of, other peer nations, how other nations were built, the avoidance of comparative learning. So sometimes you find debates here, something as basic, for example, you see we have this debate about whether to elect local government mayors, our local mayors. And then the Ghana debate is like, well, but what if the mayor from, you elect a mayor in Kumasi and the mayor in Kumasi is MPP and the president is NDC, how are they going to work together? And it's like, why are you asking this question in 2024? Are we the only place in this world where you are going to have a situation like you're describing? Freetown, even just next door, Freetown has a mayor of Freetown from a party different from the president's party. Even in Africa, so some of these kinds of things, right? We just don't learn from the experiences of others well enough. But if we did, we can then study what the experiences are. What is this country? What they made this choice? How did that choice end up, and all of that? Sure, local context matter, but I think when you say looking out for models, look, even within the East, just take the West alone, it's a very variegated group, right? So if say the model we're talking about is political model, we tend to, and that's why I think, there is certainly a good deal of salience to Yar Graham's point about, just assuming that the default model is the normal, and that's the norm. We tend to take, for example, if we talk about democracy, we tend to assume that the Anglo-American practice of it and the version of it is democracy, right? So you have to have these binary parties going at each other in a zero-sum fashion. Basically, that's how we see democracy. Winner take all, first past the post, whatever. But even within the West, as we're calling it, there is quite a range, right? European democracy, the German continental European democracy is not as conflict-driven as the Anglo-American model, for example. Scandinavian, democracy certainly even farther away from that, right? And yet there is some variegation. So there's quite a bit of variegation in the group. So even if we were just looking at, of the peg models to pick, right? And, we would not just be limited to this one Anglo-American one or that one and all of that. And you could actually, look to see which ones work depending on what situation, what circumstance and the like. So yes, it's good to sit back and look at, what it is that will work best for us. But some looking around is useful. Some looking around is useful. A lot of stuff has been tested in other places, not work quite, whether it's economic choices, policy, so you can learn. There are a lot of empirical examples and lessons to be picked from looking around and seeing what works where and that kind of stuff. So yes, I think we should sit back, reflect on the choices that we've made. I recently put out, a provocative proposal, haven't looked at the, our party politics and where it's taking us and it's not taking us. I just thought, what if we decoupled, if you want to practice presidentialism, maybe in some other place you can practice presidentialism with parties with some success. As I see it, if you have this kind of binary politics, very exclusionary, very zero-sum, and then the prize, the crown jewel is the presidency, and each party is fighting to get it. And yet the president is supposed to represent the nation. This is the one person we all vote for, and once voted for, that person is supposed to stand for all of us. Sometimes we even, take it to the extreme and call the president the father of the nation, evoking this metaphor. And yet, that party that put that person in there captures it for itself exclusively. So there's this party first agenda, right? If you have that kind of a system, well, if you just went to the market looking for, should we choose presidential system or parliamentary system? Which is basically what we do. We just look at it, presidential system, 1969, parliamentary system, 79, presidential system, 1992, let's do a little, that's about it, right? But you try it out, you see, look, in this space, if you do presidentialism, you're not going to get a president who represents the country. You're going to get a president who represents the party, right? And so what do? So I said, well, why don't we decouple, presidentialism from party politics? In other words, let's elect our president on a no-party basis, right? And we can confine the political parties to the legislative elections. It's one way you can do it. You just have to look at your circumstance. How is this playing out? I didn't start off believing in a no-party president, right? But over time, I think after looking at the record, I think there is something to be said for decoupling the presidency from political parties and then leaving the parties, they are really interested in policy and ideology, let them fight it out in parliament, but without having an opportunity to capture the president, the one, executive power. So there are ways in which we can slice these things, right? And not think that we have gotten to there are these off-the-peg models and you pick one and then you have arrived at something that works eternally for you. And, but I do think that, we are at a place now where we have to do a lot of soul searching. We have to really look deep at our problems and say, look, this is not working. If you put this here, this is what you're going to get. If you do it this way, that's what you're going to get. Look out there for examples, where we have similar situations, and you say, no, this is just not going to work. I fear, though, that somehow we've written ourselves into a constitution that constrains us hugely in terms of moving forward. So some of the agency limitations are of our own making. I think at a certain point in our history, we were at a point where we thought, okay, we need to write this thing in stone to prevent either some military adventurer or whatever from reshuffling the cards and doing some crazy stuff we didn't want. So we've written ourselves into a constitution that is very difficult to change. And sometimes I worry, that if we are not able to go back to the drawing boards and just repair certain things, that this kind of game, we're going to play it and play it and play it. And it's not going to change a whole lot. I think, for example, one of the things we did, at the point of transition in 1992 or the 1990s, is that I think what we were concerned with, we haven't seriously been concerned with good governance when we're making constitutions. At each point when we're turning to democracy again, it's been all about sending the military back to the barracks and reinstalling party politics. Yeah. So our concern has been with what I call the rules of entry and exit. Who gets to play the game of party politics? On what terms? How long do you keep in? How do you get out? So we are concerned with parties, elections, term limits, those kinds of things. Fundamental things like the rules of play, right? So if we look at the Constitution, for example, as the rules of the game, we can break them into two: rules of entry and exit and the rules of play, which is how the game of power itself is played once you get in. That fundamentally almost never changes. So we've been so concerned about playing with the rules of entry and exit. Who gets in power? How often do we have the elections? How do we, who qualifies to be a member of parliament? Who qualifies to be president? How many terms do you have? And from regime to regime, from one government to the other, the fundamental nature of how power is exercised by whom and for whose benefit. We don't do anything about the rules of play. And I think that is where, we really need to do some hard work that, otherwise we will produce what we are seeing now, which is a choiceless democracy in which you get party turnover in office. And there's nothing more depressing and I think frustrating for an electorate is to have the power seemingly to change governments and to actually change rival parties, and still have the same outcomes. Then you begin to wonder what system is producing this, right? And I think we've gotten to the point, because we've had this experience of repeat turnover of parties in office, we're getting to a point where we are losing hope. And this cannot change because the outcomes are the same. So really we are at a point where I think we have to re-examine some of the choices we've made. In 1992, some of the choices we've made. And I'm afraid that we've locked ourselves into a constitution that doesn't allow for a lot of, just basically going to the drawing boards and saying, now we have a lot more agency, maybe, as citizens. At the time, we probably didn't. You step back and say, well, now we have a lot more reflection. Now it's not a matter of, are we keeping the military regime, or if we said no to the constitution, maybe we'll keep them there for 10 more years. So let's just say yes and move on. And then in the next stage, think seriously about good governance, because really you have democracy, you don't have good governance, you're not going to get development. You're just not going to get it.
Yeah. Well, this is really turning into a national discussion. For those of you who are tuned in on radio, thank you so much for staying with us. This is our national dialogue. We're asking, should Ghana face east or west? And your views have been coming in. I'm going to read just a couple of them before we come to Doc Priscilla. This one is from Guy Fox in Tema. He says, east or west, we will still end up with nothing until and unless we fix up our own mentality towards the state and the value we place on our resources. Elder in Sunyani says, I think going to the east will be very helpful to Ghana in terms of security, economic growth, infrastructural development, human resource development, and we will be self-reliant rather than sticking to America and Europe. The two, America and Europe, are only interested in milking Ghana and Africa to develop themselves and their countries at our detriment. It's about time leadership of Ghana think outside the box for total independence. There's that sovereignty again. One more. This one is from David. He says, when our government devastates our economy They can then turn to the West, East, North, and South seeking bailouts. So much corruption in the country that even a day-born baby can feel it. Worst government so far compared to previous regimes. The future of our dear nation is enslaved. Our forest reserves, etc., sold to Chinese and others. Why? Doc, this, I think, kind of segues me nicely into the question I had in mind to ask you. If we're rethinking models, if we're trying to identify the problem we want to solve as a society, then the economic model has to be, looked at as well. And over there, it seems a bit more straightforward. We already know that we have this Gadgetsbergian economy where we are importing everything and exporting very little. We already know we need to fix that. No one seems interested. So in the meantime, with what we have, going into the next election, what should we expect to hear from potential leaders about how they intend to maximize or leverage our resources to the best interest of our nation, bearing in mind the fact that we have to deal with everyone, West, East, North, or South?
Right, Kojo, I believe that it's been established that we need to change the structure of this economy. And it ties into Professor Chrissy's presentation on the democracy we are practicing. So, for example, we know that this government came in with a very laudable idea of one district, one factory initiative with the need to add value to raw materials. And so if you ask a question, what was the origin of the initiative, first of all? It ties into the destination we want to get to as a country. And so, for example, do we have a national development plan with an ambition to develop our manufacturing sector to a certain level, for which reason every party that comes to power must contribute a certain quota to that destination we want to get to? Because we know that the destination takes quite a number of years. The destination is not a 4-year election cycle. It is not 8 years. It takes longer, decades, to work incrementally to get substantial results in terms of making your manufacturing sector competitive globally. And you see, if we keep shifting and changing parties in power and there is no longitudinal plan, and so a party comes to power, sets up a whole set of entrepreneurs to promote within the number of years they are in government. The moment there is a shift, you see that another crop of entrepreneurs come up and there is no continuity. You need to practice to perfect these models. And so for that matter, if you also come to our natural resource dependence, for example, Ghana and Ivory Coast are the largest producers of cocoa. Why can we not add a bit of value but consistently send out the raw cocoa beans? People would argue, yes, there is the need for the cash. So, for example, before the cocoa beans even get ripe or whatever, we have syndicated the revenue we would get out of it. So, under what circumstance would you be able to say, hold on, let me add a bit of value before I send out? So, the whole structure, we need to pause and think through and know that the way we are working at things is not working and we need to change course. And the courses, we will not get the results in the very short 4-year, 8-year election cycle. No matter how flowery promises may appear, the reality is it is not possible. You can get some kind of results, but sustainable results take time. It takes a lot of work. It takes commitment. It takes stability within the system. We need policy consistency. You don't want S government to come with a set of policies, another government comes with a totally new, and there is a whole uncertainty within the business environment. When that happens, it means that you do not promote the private sector, who should be at the forefront in terms of adding value, in terms of employment generation, in terms of solving the problems. And in all this, we are also faced with issues of climate change and the implications it has on our dependence on natural, on the weather, for example, for agricultural produce. So we have food security issues that are, I mean, it's in the near future, it's not even in the distant future. And there are issues of who is going to finance these demands that exist. And so in that context, I think that we should have a national consensus on the destination we want to get to, for which reason I believe whether it's Party A or Party B would take the framework and practicalize it in a way that is workable within the period that we operate. Because indeed, if you look at all the developed countries that we see, the models that are working, the models did not work within a period of 4-8 years that we seem to be consistently chasing in this country.
Which means we're just going to keep resetting the clock, even though we haven't finished the work, right? Dr. Graham, you really did justice to the Russia question. You brought out aspects of it that, you know, don't often get considered in the conversation. And it's quite clear, we've all agreed that this is not a zero-sum game. It's not about looking in one direction, east, or looking to the west, or whatever. We have to work with everybody. So it's better for us as a nation to understand the opportunities and threats that every option provides. We've talked about Russia. I wonder if we can take a look at China for a moment. And it seems like just opportunity. But there are some who are a bit concerned about China's perhaps silence on what they are getting out of it ultimately. So it would appear that little by little, while China is dealing with you, they are learning from you. They are looking at what it is that they are depending on you for and figuring out how to replace it, substitute it, right, for themselves. We've seen how they've done that with cocoa, you know, or are doing that with cocoa. And cocoa is only one example. They seem to have this plan to ultimately be able to provide whatever they need, whether or not you are willing to do business with them. Does that present a threat to those who wish to do business with China?
I mean, yeah, let's talk about China. I'll start with your question. Again, even in the formulation, I think there are some questionable things there. For example, you're thinking about cocoa. You know, we celebrate Ghana's cocoa. A bit of history. The Gold Coast, cocoa production in the Gold Coast revolutionized the way cocoa was produced. Before smallholder farmers in the Gold Coast started growing cocoa amidst their food crops, and therefore they were not completely dependent on it. It was an additional thing. If it worked and they sold, they got money. So the economics, the cost of production really was not dependent on the market because they could their subsistence. The long and short, before that, the major cocoa producing countries were all plantations. The cost of production by the Gold Coast cocoa farmer destroyed the economics of plantation cocoa and set a model for what became dominant across West Africa, from Côte d'Ivoire to Cameroon. What is the point of my thing? We built the cocoa industry by innovating and leapfrogging those who were there before us. Vietnam and others are also. The Malaysians took oil palm from West Africa. The climate there, because oil palm needs a lot of rain. It's a water stress plant. If there's a dry period, it affects. So naturally, they have a better climate for oil palm. They took it, they moved it, Indonesia, Malaysia are leading in oil palm. The Europeans went to Indonesia and India, got cotton, okay? Java, that we talk about, is a place in Indonesia.
Yeah.
They don't grow cotton in Europe. They took it, destroyed the industry there, and started selling cotton close to us. It goes round and round. So our ambition to develop, I mean, Yao made a point that when we start producing for ourselves, we are displacing somebody from our market. The only way in which you can stay ahead of the game is in how you yourself adapt and innovate. So there's nothing we can do about what the Chinese produce or do not produce. We can do a lot about what we produce or do not produce. Trade rules allow us also to manage what comes in or what doesn't come in, which is where the kinds of agreements that we sign become important. Investment rules allow us to regulate investments that come in and the terms in which they come in. The Chinese, what we can learn a lot from them, a lot. 600 million people were taken out of poverty in a short time. I mean, think about it. So, because China was a country which at one point was so dominated by the British that they could force them to allow them to sell opium because it was good business for British businessmen. Okay? They came out of that. They were part of a place was colonized by Japan at one point. After the Civil War, which the communists won, they set about building China. The project there has evolved as a mixture of a kind of communist vision and drive mixed with a long history of Chinese nationalism and also understanding of how institutions ought to function. So even if we don't copy it, there are lessons there. Because, I mean, China is a mixture of different nationalities, just like we have different ethnicities in this country. But they have forged a national project, which they are implementing. And the way in which the state has been organized around that project. If you even look at the way their foreign investment thing has evolved, you could see that in a certain period they had a plan about what they needed and liberalized the rules for those things to come in. When they advanced, they blocked it off. So there are lessons to learn from China and many other late industrializing countries. The Japanese learn from the Germans. The Chinese learn from the Japanese. The Vietnamese, I mean, there's a theory about a kind of flying geese thing where there's a lead goose and then the rest follow it. Recently, an issue has come up about the size of Vietnamese industrial exports to China. It's grown phenomenally, almost doubled in a 2-year period. And that growth seems to be almost coterminous with the restrictions that the Americans have placed on the Chinese. They have invested, they are supporting investments in Vietnam because Vietnam has access to the American market. The Americans know that it's Chinese companies, but they've kept quiet because they need those goods. So it goes back to the games that people play. So what I'm saying, so there are lessons about how to approach development. It's not to copy it, but there are lessons about, how to, in your circumstances, to approach things. So if we took those lessons, actually worry a lot less about how much iron ore they are taking out, but also work out what we get in exchange for the iron ore. Because China now, it's dominant in so many areas. They have a lot of capital. The lending by the Chinese development banks is several times what the World Bank does. Their Exim Bank is awash, with money. when the big iron ore project in Guinea, the lead Western companies to be sure of markets and financing got into bed with Chinese companies. So what I'm saying is that we need to look again at this. But for me, the thing then comes back to what are the things that we are trying to solve? I mean, some of them have been mentioned. I want to build on Priscilla's point about the economy, because we are a small country with a small home market, but dominated by a few commodities, which have distorted the way our economy functions. 3 commodities account for more than 80% of our exports: oil, gold, and cocoa. Cocoa takes huge acreage. I don't think that even with the best will in the world, the Ghana-Cote d'Ivoire axis is going to work beyond a certain point. You can add value up to a certain point. But you see, when we talk about the thing in terms of billions, tens of billions of the cocoa chocolate market, it's an exaggeration. Because at that end of it also, there are very specific consumer goods which are being produced for specific markets. The cosmetics that use cocoa butter, okay, are patented and are used in certain markets. We are not going to be able to replace all of them, even if some of them. Chocolates, again, so we need to even ask the question whether, in fact, the dominance of cocoa in Ghanaian agriculture is something that we should not be thinking about reducing in the medium term. The cocoa farmers themselves are giving their farms to Galamsey people. Why? Because on the rational economic calculation, it is not worth the trouble. The poverty in cocoa growing areas, because of the inefficiencies that they face. I was in a seminar a week ago, just listening to people, the farmers, talk about what is going on. There's a woman said, as for me, I'm going to cut all my cocoa and grow coconuts and oil palm, anything but cocoa. The Ghana government is dependent on the foreign exchange for cocoa. So they and the companies who need the quality cocoa beans from Ghana need it. But the farmer can plant anything and make a living. In the same way they were planting something before cocoa came. Some farmers who are growing, say, producing cassava, for example, or yams, if they can grow in the same area, in economic terms, the farmers may want to make a switch. So there's even the thinking to make about this, we'll grow 2 million tons and so on. Can we envisage a time that Ghana is growing 500,000 tons of cocoa and growing something else?
Like what?
Many things. I'm posing the question. The land that cocoa has taken, cocoa as one single crop which has caused the most deforestation in our history, because it's always looking for virgin soil. So it started in the mountains, Ikwapim Mountains, came down the hill into Achim, moved through the eastern region, into central region, into Ashanti, into BA, down into the western region, looking for frontiers, virgin frontiers. Those lands can grow other things, because that's the kind of the richest forest areas. We take it for, we are proud, but cocoa is an accident crop in this country. It's an accident crop. It could have been coffee. So even to think about the commodity dependence means to think about what do we, if we are talking about food security, diversification, and so on, do we have to stay with cocoa with the farmers? Can we get foreign exchange from other sources? That's one. And then you look at our extractives. Gold is a mineral which is much in demand. But compared to other minerals, gold is actually a relatively useless mineral. I mean, the primary thing you get for it is that you sell it. But the bulk of it goes into fashion or into hoards for storage of wealth. It is not as useful, for example, as clay. Clay is a much more useful mineral than gold. If you look at the multipliers that you get from clay, you build your house, It triggers the carpenter to make a bed and to make windows. It goes on and on. Pripsla understands multipliers better than I do. You know, but so I'm being provocative here with the clay thing. So we don't even pay attention to the minerals that will be beneficial for our domestic markets or for our regional markets. Mineral policy is dominated by exports. We are facing an energy transition on this continent as much as anywhere else. Every single African government is in a race to sign a deal to export our critical minerals. And yet, our own energy future, there's no conversation about what our critical minerals can contribute to it. So that whole commodity demand, we need to dismantle it. Which also means that if you come to agriculture, because we are talking about plants and plants, the thing is, regime, kind of government changes. Kwesi made the point. We've had we had policy continuities, irrespective of government, which means that there's a policy consensus within the ruling elite. Part of the problem we face is how do we break that policy consensus and get other perspectives introduced. We've done a study on the one district, one factory, alongside a study on the planting for food and jobs. We had a series of seminars. We're having the last one in Accra on the 11th of June, looking at the story is very sad. It's a very sad story where the lack of connection and coordination between two streams that should be working together for structural change. There's no coordination. You see, so there are persistent problems. The smallholder farmer who needs support is seen to be a problem. We need to replace them with large scale. People say we need to turn agriculture into a business. But actually, the most successful model of agriculture as a business is a smallholder cocoa farmer. The whole world is queuing to buy the product of the smallholder, and they've been doing it for more than 100 years. And yet we talk about turning agriculture into a business when we have successful business model from the illiterate smallholder cocoa farmer for more than 100 years. And yet smallholder farmers are considered to be a problem. But you go to other places where they've had smallholder farmers as a key part of the agriculture. How do you build productivity of the smallholder farmer? It's not with the exclusion of large scale and so on. Appropriate technology, but in our research, people are complaining about how they cannot get access to tractors to plow. They cannot get access to harvesters for their rice at the appropriate time. You go to other places where they've made good agricultural transition. They developed technologies that were accessible and cheap enough and simple enough to go with the conditions. We need land reform in this country. I mean, we don't talk about it. Land reform, land ownership and control patterns as we have them are a block to economic progress in this country. The land law has basically handed over the management of that land problem to the people who are the main source of the problem, chiefs and family heads. Everywhere that they've had a proper agrarian transition, the land question has been addressed. So there are issues which are not even in the discussion. And with that land question also goes the question of the extra constitutional power that traditional leaders have. You see, one of the problems we also have is that we have a republic and a democracy, but actually we still have the indirect rule state that was constructed by the British. We must dismantle the indirect rule state so that a republican constitution based on the equality of citizens and rights becomes the foundation of the good governance Kwesi is talking about.
So, emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, from neocolonialism, and from cuckoo. Wow, that's provocative. Thanks for that. Now, Yao Nsako, I want us to do a bit of a change of gear for a moment. There's strength in numbers, we keep being told. In your measured opinion, should the next government join BRICS?
Well, it is not just a question of joining BRICS nominally. I have referred to the spirit of Bandung and the spirit of the tricontinental. There is something to be gained in coming together, realizing that we are small, fragmented entities, and you can't take on the world in that kind of way. But I derive the relevance of BRICS differently. I think if you ask the question between a unipolar world and a multipolar world, which is better for small countries like us, it's not a big debate. It's very clear in our minds that multipolarity is a better place to be. It gives you some flexibility if you know how to. So therefore, the idea of counterpowers emerging to the main hegemonic power is useful to us. I have absolutely no doubt in my mind. Do we yet know the full destination of BRICS? That's where agency comes in, because we tend to talk about BRICS and so on as though it is somebody's agenda, and we jump onto it. What is our own view about what we want from BRICS? We have talked about some of the internal challenges of the pivotal countries. You take the BRICS themselves. Brazil has its own structural issues. It is trying to deal with them, but it has its own structural issues. Russia, we have talked about some of them. India made progress, but let's not kid ourselves. 700 million people are still poor there. There's Modi with his Hindu nationalism. We're not totally sure where he's going, and so on and so forth. I could go on and go through all of them. So it's not just a question of that you jump on board. I think the idea that you have people who introduce multipolarity into the world so that there are checks and balances, absolutely unassailable. In my view, that is necessary to have in the world. But if we just go and join BRICS and we do the same neoliberal short-termism and so on and so forth that we're talking about, then absolutely nothing changes. And that's what I suspect my colleagues are trying to point out again and again. You didn't ask me the question, but I want to take advantage to say a few things. So I heard Kwesi talking about the non-party president. I like the idea that people are asking fundamental questions. One of the big problems we have in this country is that I don't know what we are busy about, given that we don't deliver anything. But there's just not enough thinking space about what we're doing, either in the future or how we learn the historical perspective. So if you go and take models where the massive accumulation of capital in those societies happened through slavery and colonialism, and you believe that is going to work for you in 2024, you must first ask yourself the question, who are you going to colonize in 2024? Where are you going to source these slaves from? So that model may not apply for you in today's world. Therefore, the newly industrialized countries, I don't say that we should just ape them totally, but they offer a significant example to us in terms of what have they done differently. How have they been able to navigate all these polarities and come out? Because the pathways with which other people accumulated capital may not be available to us today. If you ask yourself those questions, and some of the things that Yal was talking about, you know, that I fully identify. I do not know a country throughout human history that did not benefit from colonialism or slavery that made it to prosperity without radical land reforms. If we succeed, we will be the first in human history, and I wonder why we will be the only ones. So that's a major issue. As soon as you touch on that, when I talk about this, people always get uncomfortable. If you are going to do significant land reforms, it raises the issue of the competence of the state, number one, and two, what is the role of chieftaincy in the modern republic? I don't say abolish chieftaincy, but they are rogue features of chieftaincy. They're absolutely rogue features to the extent that sometimes you are not sure who really is in charge of this country. Are we first subjects and then citizens after, or the other way around? Where does the real power lie? I give the example again and again. A guy, he says, family head or something in Kwabenya, he says that an MCE has taken land and he's unhappy about it. He holds a press conference with the leading newspapers and media houses sitting there, and he says in public that if the president does not remove the MCE, he will show him his wrath. You can say this to the commander-in-chief. You will show him your wrath. What the hell do you mean by that? And this is not even a paramount chief or any kind. He's some traditional, I don't know what, headman something. He can say this. So you have a breakdown of discipline that shows in the land issues. An inconsistency, somebody can have a business for 5 years, and then somebody wakes up and says that a deity in the place does not like goats, so shut it down. You cannot, in a modern system, run like that. So these are big questions. But if we acknowledge that they are big questions, then it takes us to the point that I'm now going to make. Whether we have a non-partisan presidency, non-partisan parliament, or what, there is the big question of these political parties that we have today. Are they fit for purpose? Who do they represent in real terms? Do they have their own very constricted class interest, and the rest of us, they're giving 4 years, every 4 years, some sort of choice is given. I'm saying that we are now faced with a choice of 2 times 3, 6, and half a dozen. Because it doesn't change anything, whoever comes. There's a certain continuity. It has built its own stability because everybody knows that your turn will come, so just wait. So there is, when I look at the newly industrialized countries, the question of the model, many people think in terms of a very high level. But one of the things that comes out of all of them is that they had some sort of organization that represented the people. The people themselves were the motive force of those organizations. The people who were leading those organizations, they had a sense of history about where the people had come from, and they knew fundamentally that they were accountable. It may change if you go to Singapore, it's slightly different from what you see in China, etc. But those are the central tenets. Today, we do not have it. I went looking for the figure, and interestingly, it was a report that Kwesi Prempeh and Gbekwasare worked on, that I first got the figure that to win a presidential election in Ghana cost $100 million. And there are 2 main contenders, so that's $200 million already. If you take that organization and you continue it, immediately, it doesn't tell you, you don't need to think too far, your whole public procurement system will collapse. So people coming into power today, what is the first thing that they must think about? The next 4 years, where am I going to get money to be able to do this? We can sit here and talk about meritocracy, whether we look west, east, whatever. The politician is focused on where am I getting money from. They will not appoint people. Who is going to make Yao Graham interior minister? He'll come and ask all these questions that he's asking. Or go and put Kwesi Prempeh to be what? OSP? No. So you put people who are malleable, who will do your jobs for you. So fundamentally, before we even start to talk about economic model, we must clean up this political system. And the debate is not necessarily, do we have parties? They have parties in Singapore, they have them in Scandinavia, and their system works there. So that may not be the issue. The issue is that the laws that we have put down to govern this system, we are not able to implement them. And so you have a corroded and incompetent state that represents certain specific class interests. Yesterday, I was having a discussion with some of the leaders of the bar. You know what has happened in the country. I think you're all quiet. Because this now represents your class interest. They say to me, well, they speak is contempt. I say, well, I hope that when it's armed robbers, you say the same thing. That really is the issue. And you see, every time I've spoken, I've come back to we all, because many of us were involved, I know Kwesi Prempeh and Yao and so on, we're very involved in the demilitarization process. I think that an inbuilt assumption, when I look back, that we all made was that when that transition happened, there was going to be more agency for the people. I concede that the citizens may be speaking a bit more, but it's a certain specific kind of citizen. And we have normalized elite interests to think that they are national interests. So listen to the conversation. I'll give one example and then I'll stop. I was telling somebody that Old Mutual had issued a report which said that only 5% of the Ghanaian population earns above $500 a month, and that 80% of the population earns below $250. And now with the CD having taken another knock, the figures may be even more adverse than that. And the person's response to me was, so who are filling all these flights that are leaving Ghana and all these houses that we see? So I said, you see, the challenge we have in our society is that we are not scientific. Our discussions are not precise. They are not driven by data. Let's do a simple calculation. How many flights do you say fall in the category that you're talking about? It says like, well, maybe like 10. So, okay, fine. Make it 10 if you want. On average, each plane carries about how much? They gave me the figure of 200. I said, make it 300. Therefore, you're talking about 3,000 people a day. Multiply that by 30. What's the figure? And then divide that by 32 million. How does that become representative? So you will hear me harp on this again and again. And another example that I give is what happened in North Tongo, Mipe. We just opened a dam, flooded 36,000 people, displaced them. There's no noise in the city. Absolutely none. Because none of them is your Graham's classmate or Priscilla's classmate. One of them was a bar president with Akufo-Addo, so they don't know anybody. So we shut them, they become Ralph Ellison's invisible men. And my worry, why I keep harping on this, is not all altruistic. Any people who are kept in this sort of situation, particularly when they are the majority, when we now even think about who the average Ghanaian is, we think it's people like us, but we're not. The average Ghanaian is closer to peasantry than the people who are around. If we keep them under this democratic arrangement, completely disengaged from what is happening in the center, because it becomes an Accra-centric, Kumasi-centric democracy, eventually the system will be disrupted. I don't want it to happen. I've been public about my opposition to the coups that are happening in West Africa, and so I'm not asking for it to happen. But we must know that there is no way that we can continue with this degree of immiseration of large numbers of our compatriots who are now reduced to a token participation once in 4 years and somehow think that it will continue. So the urgency that we must do this with is really high. And the space and time must be made. In our educational system, I commend you. I think this is a useful discussion that you are having on the media. You know, I've been extremely critical about the things that you guys focus on. Part of the reason why we don't know our history, why we don't know what's going on in the world, is because the media itself is completely dislodged and dislocated. And I could go on and on. We're sitting in May, the rains are coming. That's when the media has also now picked up the issue that nothing was done. And it goes on and on and on. So these are fundamental issues that we must first get our act together. Talk to the Chinese. One thing they always tell you, they are not very clear what Africa itself wants out of the relationship with China. And we ourselves don't know. The people we send are thinking about their own interest. So we could go on and on, but let me just make it bullet points so that we can learn. One, our development discourse. I prefer to call it that than to call it economics, because it's much more than that. It's a larger thing. One, it must be based not on dogma. It must be based on science and facts. There's too much dogma. Somebody says, and when you say dogma, people think you're talking about East Timor. No, even the things that we bandy around, the free market, free market is the engine, private sector is the engine of growth. Where was the private sector the engine of growth under $3,000 GDP per capita? You show me in history. It's never happened. But we bandy these things, and then we just, government or business is government, and so on and so forth. We just run with it. By the same token, the other side does the same thing. But we are different spaces. Our politics must be reconstructed around what Amilcar Cabral said. The people are not following it for the ideas in anybody's head. They are following it for how their lives will become better. They'll get more food, they'll get clothes on their back, they'll get decent accommodation. They too can live in dignity. That really, in my view, is what matters. And I'd like to end at this point by saying again, the time bound for these things that we are all talking about is not infinite. We must never lull ourselves into thinking that it is infinite. It is not infinite. The disruption may not lead to a better society. But if you keep things this way, you cannot stop it from happening. Let me stop there before I get into trouble.
My word. All right. Now, a couple of tweets, because Bright is still engaging all of you on X. So this one is from Dave. He says, we seem to have moved to the pro-West camp. In fact, for the past 7+ years, we don't seem to know where we are. What is our current foreign policy? Do we really move anything, even in Africa? Look at our foreign minister, Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana. Chiakai, he says. That's a technical term. All right, Bright Anand says, can't we just do business with everybody on our own terms? I think that's better than aligning East or West. There are lots more. I will share them with you when we come back from these messages. And then, of course, it'll be time for us to start to conclude this conversation. And our panelists will advise you on how to vote. In context of this conversation, what are the sort of things you should hear from a person who you can have faith in to lead Ghana in a good foreign policy direction? We'll discuss those when we come back. You know, time flies when you're having intellectual conversations. That's what we've been doing since 6 p.m. here on this National Dialogue. Brought to you on JoyNews, Joy 99.7 FM, and on all our social media platforms. The hashtag that is making the rounds is East or West. We're also using the hashtag Joy Dialogues, and your thoughts and views have been coming in thick and fast. Lots of very fascinating stuff that we're going to share. Our guest, by the way, just in case you need a reminder, Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh is from CDD. Dr. Yao Graham is from Third World Network Africa. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo. I'm speaking prophetically. Dr. Priscilla Chumesi-Bafo is an economics lecturer at the University of Ghana. Yao Nsako represents an amalgam of business groups. And we have been having moderation on X by Bright Simmons, who, of course, is Vice President in charge of research at Imani. It's been sparkling so far, and we're going to start wrapping things up shortly. But not before I share a few of your tweets before we get back into the conversation. And by the way, I keep calling them tweets. I need to learn to call them posts since we're no longer doing Twitter. It's all X now, isn't it? Bright Simmons has been engaging all of you on X, and here are a couple of your posts before we continue the conversation. Now, this one is from Alade. He says, aligning with the West is one of the greatest mistakes any African country could make, especially Ghana. It's not a shame. Is it not a shame and an insult for the US to unilaterally dare to dictate to us as to whom we should trade with or intimidate us with senseless sanctions? PK Bansa says, well, it depends on how you frame recent. I think he's responding to an earlier tweet. Historically, we do know when Ghana became pro-West, but that doesn't also mean we have jettisoned our Pacific relationship with Eastern Bloc nations. If you take the Sino-Hydro project and bilateral trade deals with China and others into account. All right, so we've established that there are risks and benefits no matter who we deal with as a nation. But either way, there must be some policy direction. We must hear some plan for the foreign policy of Ghana so that we can maximize our resources to the best of our ability. Let's start thinking about what such a plan should look like. And as voters going into the booth in December, what should we expect to hear from a leader who wants to run this country for the next 4 years that will help us feel confident that in terms of our foreign policy, we'll be making prudent decisions? Prof.
Well, I think what we should not be hearing is one party or regime benchmarking itself against the other, which is what we've been doing, right? So our politics has gotten to a point where, it's almost a race to the bottom. So the NPP benchmarks itself against the NDC in performance, in ideology, whatever it is that they stand for. And they tell you, well, yeah, you did this, but you also sold this number of state assets to this one, right? I think when, at some point in the conversation, Yao, one or the other Yao made some interesting point mentioning, China and Japan and all of that. And there's an important lesson there, which is that successful nations have benchmarked themselves, at least in our very recent modern history. Nations at our level of development that emerged roughly around the same time that we emerged out of colonialism. So Singapore benchmarked itself, or wanted something to prove to Malaysia, which is where it began and then was more or less expelled. And said, okay, well, so, China wanted something to prove to Japan, later on wanted something to prove to America, South Korea wanted something to prove to Japan. So these countries have sought a place in the sun for themselves. They've had some ambition. And one of the ways those ambitions have expressed themselves is through benchmarking, finding some aspirational rival, right? It may not be real, but finding some country that becomes your aspirational rival and saying, I want to be like this or better than this country in X number of years. We don't have that.
Who would make a good?
Well, and we may not have to just choose one country, but we can benchmark ourselves maybe sector by sector. We say, well, in this area, we think that we find a country in a peer class. And it's important, I think, because the historical moment where these countries emerged out of poverty or out of underdevelopment is important. So you may not be able to replicate the American experience, right? And because you can't go through, slavery and colonialism and all of that. So maybe that's not where you do your benchmarking. Choose a country in your peer class, roughly emerging around the time that you emerged as an independent nation, and see what they've done successfully. And it doesn't have to be everything they've done. If Botswana has done something good in, say, how you make mining deals, why they've been able to get maybe DBS to share 50-50 or whatever, then you do that, and then you study that, and what did they do right? And if Singapore has done something, whether in governance, right, which is really where we suffer, then what has Singapore done right about governance, about building an effective civil service, about building, because one of the things we do here is that somehow the political class believes that because we're doing something called democracy and you get elected, that even if you are competent, even if you don't know what it is that, here, I always say, it's like here, power is knowledge, right? The fact that you have been elected doesn't mean that the country must be run 98% by politicians based on political partisan criteria. Yeah. Where is the technocracy? Where is the civil service? Where is an effective civil service that actually runs the country? So here, the distinction between public administration and politics is completely disappeared. Politicians believe that when you get elected, you run the country whether you know what you're doing or not. And if you criticize them, well, if you know anything, go and run for election. So there's no country I know in the world that has developed following that model of politicians believing that merely by virtue of having won an election, you are entitled to actually run the country on a day-to-day basis with no public administration to check you, to stop you, nothing. Right? So we just have to look at it and see what are these other countries doing that are getting ahead, and then benchmark yourself against this MPP, NDC benchmark is not going to, it's a race to the bottom. It's not going to take us anywhere.
Benchmark ourselves against peer nations.
Successful ones.
Yes, successful peer nations. Okay, we're going to whip around really quickly. I'm told that our time is running out. Dr. Graham, Same question, really. What should we expect to hear from a leader that will instill hope in us that our foreign policy will be heading in a better direction?
I would want, among other things, to hear some clear perspectives about Ghana, relations in West Africa, Ghana, relations in Africa, and how we do things together. Because, I mean, the value of cooperation and integration is not simply a slogan. It's an imperative for a small country. Yeah, I talked about, multipolarity and so on and so forth. Small countries need that. The corollary of that is also how being in groupings allow you to punch above your weight. Yeah. When you look at our influence, where we've been able to negotiate properly in international fora, it's because countries stuck together. The WTO, the power of the West in the WTO, collapsed in Cancun in 2003 when developing countries stood together. When African countries began to peel away from each other, the European Union was able to pick us individually and got us to sign economic partnership, agreements. The research that we did on One District, One Factory, a fascinating thing came out from the Middle Belt, the Ashanti and those other regions. Poultry farmers told us that the marketing of maize, the system is so poor that they get most of their maize from Côte d'Ivoire. When they say they want 100 trucks, they deliver it on time. When they come and buy the droppings, chicken droppings, to use for manure. We are busy importing fertilizer. But the point I make here is that there's a regional trade mechanism which exists, which could be improved, which will expand markets and stimulate people, and the other way around. So regionalism in that way, which actually serves ordinary people, I think it's important. And it goes into the challenges emerging in the region around security. The reconstruction of ECOWAS in a direction which is in the interest of the people rather than playing geopolitics, I think is also a kind of challenge. There are a number of initiatives around which Africa needs to organize itself because the multilateral system is in crisis. It is reconstituting itself into fragments of geopolitical blocks. Africa must begin to find its way in how, within this reconfiguration, we are able to advance our interest. So for me, that then would fit into the business of, north, south, east, and west, and so on and so forth. That's just one small point.
Thanks, Doc. Dr. Priscilla, what should these people be telling us?
Okay, Kujo, I believe that we've established that a diversified group of economic cooperation is what we need, and in doing that, we have to know exactly what we want, and so for that matter, go for it. And so we have to forge partnerships that would support our agenda. But principally, I believe that our leaders should know that no matter how well the intentions of partners are, our development is principally our responsibility. And so we cannot continuously, quote unquote, put our destinies in the hands of people and expect that the miracle would occur. And in conclusion, I would like to borrow the words of John F. Kennedy, who said that if a free society cannot help the many that are poor, it cannot save the few that are rich. And in that context, whoever is out there that has the intention to lift the many out of poverty in the area of generation of productive jobs, particularly for young people, is the one that would have my bet.
Thanks. Yao Nsako, I saved you for last. 1.5 million voters will be voting for the first time this year. Now, if they're listening and they've heard us talk about how important our foreign policy is and how we leverage our resources going into the future is, what will your advice be for them about how to choose the next leader? What should they be looking out for?
Well, only because we have all talked about multipolarity being desirable, and Jack Kennedy got quoted, maybe I should quote Mao Zedong. I think an equilibration mechanism. Somebody told me this morning, he said, I know the two people who are going to say East. I said, really? I don't know. Well, we will see after the event. That person probably realizes that he was wrong. But what I've been saying, and most of the other people have been saying, is that whoever it is we vote for, we have to deconstruct the class capture that we have. Now, I say it differently in other contexts, whether it's democracy, development, economics, whatever, even the rising sun, Pan-Africanism, whatever, we have to subordinate it to the agenda of how do we lift our people out of poverty. And I often point this out. I say when the Chinese were doing what they were doing, it's one example of where they talked about their progress, not in terms of the number of billionaires that were being created, even in terms of the growth of their economy. They talked in terms of the number of people that were being lifted out of poverty. And in modern history, at least, no other country has been able to deliver an economic construct that has lifted almost all their people out of poverty. So there are lessons. But as we have said, life is and you don't look to one place to say, that's the only thing that I'm going to learn. Now, if you're going to be able to learn and absorb from the number of people, do this in coalitions as countries and so on, then you must also move away from a country that has a dominant culture of superstition and become, whether it's intellectual superstition or what, when we talk at a certain level, we think that is superstition. But if you go around talking about economic paradigms and so on, which have not been proven in practice, in my view, I call that intellectual superstition as well. So we must move our politics to become a politics that is driven by science and facts. And as Jones said, we follow the path of integrity wherever it leads.
Yeah.
Whoever we find that represents that, that's the person you vote for. I can add that so far I have not seen that person, but there are a few months ago, maybe that will change.
We live in hope. We live in hope. That's where we're going to have to put a pin in it, but this is only the first in a series of conversations on this topic. Special thanks to Professor H. Kwesi Prempeh, Dr. Yao Graham, Dr. Priscilla Chumesi Bafo, Yao Nsako, and Bright Simmons. It has been a delight to bring you this conversation. Our biggest thanks are to you for staying with us for 3 hours. My name is Kojo Yankson. I wish you a wonderful weekend. Let's keep talking. Have a good night.